In 2023, I dedicated myself to clearing as many games from my backlog as I could, and I managed to burn through 63 of them before the year finally came to a close. Come 2024, I knew that the number of games I beat would drop dramatically, but I was still determined to play through as many as I had the time for. Let's get started. I was fortunate enough to have all three of the major consoles growing up, but despite that, my brothers and I ended up playing a lot of licensed games. While the GameCube, PS2, Xbox generation was known for having some all-time classics like the original Halo, Super Mario Sunshine, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, God of War, etc., we never ended up playing some of the PS2's most iconic franchises like Ratchet and Clank. The series always stood out to me because when I got a PS3 and was deciding what game to get with it, I kept circling back to Ratchet and Clank Tools of Destruction at the store because the box art looked cool to me. Of course, I ended up ignoring my instincts and bought Spider-Man 3 instead, so that was a mistake. This year though, I finally sat down and played through my first game in the series, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. I'm not entirely familiar with the franchise itself, my only real exposure being the movie that came out in 2016 that I fell asleep during twice. I went into Rift Apart with an open mind and came away genuinely impressed by the visual fidelity of the various worlds and the writing. The variety of guns the game offers were great, with some of my favorites being the lightning rod and the ricochet. My biggest gripe with the game was the amount of stuttering and frame drops on Savali while you were free roaming, but luckily it wasn't present on the other planets. Overall, I found Rift Apart to be a great introduction to the series, and I'd be interested in playing previous installments in the future. Immortals Fenyx Rising was one of the first games to jump on the formula that Nintendo put into place with Breath of the Wild, and I don't think any studio has managed to capture what I liked about that game more than Ubisoft Quebec was able to do with Immortals. Think of it like Breath of the Wild but based in Greek mythology. The glider has been replaced with a pair of Daedalus wings, and you familiarize yourself with some of gods of legends like Aphrodite and Ares. The game is told through the lens of Zeus and Poseidon as they bicker over how certain events played out and chime in with their own remarks, similar to Stotler and Waldorf. I was entranced by the Golden Isle itself and tracked down every side quest, collectible, vaults, and everything in between. The combat variety and the combos you could perform between all of your weapons and godly powers was always fun, and I never found myself bored or dreading to encounter more enemies. I wish Ubisoft would give the series another shot, as it managed to carve out its own identity from the Ubisoft formula, and I'd be interested in seeing where they take Fenyx's journey in another installment. Also, Ubisoft, if you're watching this, please add the Steam achievements for this game already. You're adding them back to all your old games now that you came crawling back to Steam, so please don't neglect this one. Shaq-Fu, A Legend Reborn was garbage. I remember the initial buzz in 2014 surrounding the Indiegogo campaign for a sequel to the infamous SNES game, and me being the naive teenager I was, even thought about funding it because I wanted the Shaq-Fu statue that was included for pledging $500. I did not do that because I was fiscally responsible. So now, nearly a decade later, I made the fiscally irresponsible decision of buying Shaq-Fu A Legend Reborn in 2024. What drew me to this game was because at the time, my employer was producing Shaq's podcast, and I had assisted with some of the clips you might have seen circulating on social media. I knew not to expect much going into it, but I still managed to come away feeling like it wasn't worth the 4 hours I spent 100%ing it in one day. The combat boiled down to just button mashing, and the game felt more like an arcade experience that you would only have to pay a couple of quarters for. As far as I'm aware, most of the stretch goals and promised features from the crowdfunding campaign were never delivered, which does make me question whether or not the developers really ended up donating 5% of all sales to the Boys and Girls Club of America. The Pedestrian is a 2D puzzle platforming game that sees you playing as the little pictogram stick figures typically found on traffic signs. I dabble in puzzle games every now and then, hoping to recapture some of the magic of when I first played The Witness, but personally, The Pedestrian didn't land with me. Some of the solutions seemed a bit too convoluted, and that's not even taking into account the ending, which comes out of nowhere and only ended up further confusing me. I can see the appeal of the game, it just wasn't for me. One game that I played for hours on end growing up was Zoo Tycoon and its expansions. Zoo Tycoon 2 expanded on the original by transitioning to 3D and letting you get up close and personal with the animals, and Planet Zoo managed to take that feeling and expand upon it. I primarily played through the career mode, which has you restoring zoos around the world in order to expose your previous employer's criminal behavior. Getting the gold standard for all of the levels was extremely challenging, and much like Frontier Development's sister series, Planet Coaster, you have to balance all aspects of running the zoo, like training your staff, meeting guest needs, researching new ways to enrich the animal exhibits, and improving your zoo's conservation rating by releasing endangered species was a nice balancing act on top of expanding my zoo itself. I also found the way that the online connection worked in franchise mode enticing, as it let you trade and sell your animals to others around the world for their own zoos. When it comes to video game genres, roguelikes are up there at the top for me, so when I finally took the time to play the first AAA roguelike in Returnal, I had high expectations. The biggest compliment I can give Returnal is that the gunplay and movement were both very satisfying. Weaving in and around environments and taking out enemies with precision were definite highlights for me, but two parts of the game just didn't click for me. Look, I'm not the brightest crayon in the box when it comes to understanding time loops, but Returnal's time loop and overarching narrative with the astronaut didn't make much sense to me upon playing. Watching a few story explanations after the fact helped alleviate some of it, but I'm not a big codex guy in games, so I usually gloss over all of that stuff. The other part of Returnal that didn't click with me was the difficulty, or in my case, the lack thereof. The first two biomes are challenging as you are introduced to and familiarize yourself with the game's mechanics, but after dying roughly 3 times in both the Overgrown Ruins and the Crimson Wastes, I managed to beat the entire rest of the campaign in a single attempt. I can only assume that this was a skill difference thing for me, as most of the buzz I had seen for Returnal focused on its harsh difficulty. My favorite part of Returnal, however, was the side mode, the Tower of Sisyphus. This felt more like the traditional roguelike experience I was looking for, as you climb the endless tower, doomed to meet your eventual demise. The tower clicked with me more than the main campaign, as I succumbed several times and continuously upgraded my arsenal to fit my preferred playstyle. Few game series are as beloved and controversial among their own fanbase than Life is Strange. The fourth game in the series, Life is Strange True Colors, goes back to the series' roots of taking place in a small town as opposed to the cross-country expedition of the second game. Across all of the protagonist's supernatural powers in the series, Alex's ability to see emotions definitely felt the most underwhelming compared to Max's ability to rewind time and Daniel's telekinesis. But in the quaint setting of Hayden Springs, it felt right for an outsider like Alex to be able to explore the human emotions of a town where everyone knows each other. After leaving foster care and reuniting with her brother Gabe, he dies in a tragic accident that leaves you and the rest of the town in despair. You work to find out what caused the blast that led to his untimely death, and while I had my suspicions early on that ultimately turned out to be true, I can see why so many people get emotionally attached to the characters in this series and the stories that Don't Nod and now Deck 9 tell. Overcooked 2 is a co-op game where you and up to 3 other friends frantically run around kitchens and serve customers their requested dishes. It's a great co-op game that is just simple enough that you could play with anyone of any skill level, with the additional challenge of getting 3 stars on every level for those looking for more difficulty. I definitely recommend this one to anyone looking for a fun game to play with friends. I know I harped on this last year, but I'm not a big fan of RPGs that require more brain power than Pokemon's battle system, which is why I've never been able to get into games like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. Enter The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, which ditches the traditional turn-based combat for a more action-oriented focus. I'm not familiar with Andrzej Sapkowski's world, yet The Witcher 3 has touted that it isn't necessary to play the first 2 games of the series to enjoy the story. I agree for the most part, with my only minor gripe being that some characters like Trish show up and me not knowing who they are or what their significance to Geralt is. It wasn't among my favorite games that I played this year, but I easily see why the series is so revered and how this entry became one of the best-selling games of all time. Also, I kept thinking that Skellige was called Skeledirge. Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number was just more Hotline Miami, but with multiple storylines going on at the same time. I'd end up forgetting what was going on in each chapter as it bounced back and forth between the protagonists. The music, though, much like the original, still slapped. Circling back to games I played as a kid, another one of my favorites was Spongebob Squarepants Battle for Bikini Bottom. After Purple Lamp Studios remade the game in 2020, Nickelodeon and THQ Nordic gave them the green light to create a spiritual sequel, culminating in SpongeBob SquarePants The Cosmic Shake. It retains all of the charm of the show, featuring the entire voice cast, including Clancy Brown as Mr. Krabs this time. While it took a little while for me to get used to the physics of the Cosmic Shake compared to what I've been used to playing for the past 20 years, I settled into a groove and I felt like I was re-experiencing my childhood. They did a great job remaining faithful to the source material, and my only complaint was that the game felt significantly shorter than the previous one, and I would have liked there to be more Wishing Worlds to explore than the 6 that were present. I was skeptical of Hogwarts Legacy from the moment it was revealed. Based on the early trailers for the game, I came away thinking that it was just another Harry Potter cash grab with paint-by-the-numbers combat and enemies. While the combat did ultimately prove to be cookie-cutter, I can't help but come away impressed by how well Avalanche Software managed to make Hogwarts School feel like a character itself. Every nook and cranny of the castle and the surrounding grounds felt like it was hiding a secret for me to find, and it made the game's narrative, which was fine in its own right, feel almost secondary to exploring Hogwarts, Hogsmeade, and the surrounding landscapes. Flying brooms, riding fantastic beasts, brewing potions, Summoner's Court, the Dueling Club, and more made this the Harry Potter game fans had been dreaming of for years. Thankfully, there was no Quidditch, because that game is inherently flawed and I'm tired of pretending that it's not. Also, I was a Ravenclaw, and if you're going to debate about what Hogwarts house you think you really belong in, then you're also a Ravenclaw, nerd. Kena Bridge's spirits might look cute on the surface, but underneath its beautifully animated exterior lies a game that packs a decent challenge with some tense boss fights. It's hard to talk about this game without constantly gushing over the visuals, with dense environments and vibrant colors popping off the screen as you control your little rock companions in battle. I'm curious to see where Ember Lab goes from here, and if they plan on making more games in the future. I like to see them get the opportunity to work on an animated Zelda film, judging by the work that they did on their short, Majora's Mask: A Terrible Fate. HiFi Rush just didn't click with me the way I wanted it to. I really wanted to like the game, but I could never get into the rhythm and find my footing with the combat. I liked it for what it was, and I'm glad that games like this exist, but personally, this one just wasn't for me. Everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong when Volition decided to reboot the Saints Row franchise. Set in a new city of Santo Ileso, the game follows the rise of the Saints as they go from a ragtag group of friends to kingpins of a criminal empire. I've always had a soft spot for the Saints Row series, and I was as disappointed as everyone else when this game was announced and looked nothing like the Saints Row of old. But despite that, I really enjoyed the reboot for what it was, and yes, it definitely had its cringeworthy moments. What game doesn't nowadays? Cringe is in the eye of the beholder, after all. It's still the same dumb fun as the previous entries in the series, from the side hustles and wacky costumes, to a story that doesn't take itself too seriously. I don't blame others for not giving the game a chance, but if you are ever having second thoughts, I'd recommend giving it a shot. It's still Saints Row, but it's more like great value Saints Row, which isn't a bad thing per se. Warner Bros. Struck gold with the Batman Arkham games, and with that series coming to an end following Arkham Knight, there's a Batman-sized hole in their portfolio that they've needed to fill. Enter Gotham Knights. It's a Batman spin-off where you play as 4 of his protégés, Nightwing, Robin, Batgirl, and Red Hood, as they seek to avenge Batman's death. While it's not a part of the Arkhamverse, the game did itself a massive disservice by not carrying over some of the series' hallmarks. The gameplay of the 4 heroes offered a nice variety of abilities and weapons, but the combat itself lacked the fluidity that the Arkham games are known for. Traversal around Gotham also felt much slower, and while I can chalk that up to the cast not being as experienced with their gadgets as Batman, traversing through the air felt so much slower than just cruising on the Bat-cycle. For the longest time, my experience with the Halo franchise was the first few levels of Combat Evolved, the Blood Gulch map that was installed on every computer in my high school, and Halo Infinite's multiplayer. A couple of years back, I played through the first 2 Halo campaigns on Nightmare with a friend, and this year me and another friend went in and blasted through Halo 3's campaign, also on Nightmare of course. Obviously I missed the Halo zeitgeist in its prime, but I can appreciate the games for what they're worth, even though I haven't bothered to touch the multiplayer in the previous entries of the series. Oh my precious little Sackboy. Big bad Sony can't hurt you anymore. With Sony pulling the plug on all Little Big Planet servers earlier this year, Sackboy and the Little Big Planet series have unofficially been put to rest. Sackboy did get one last final hurrah though, back in 2020 with the release of Sackboy A Big Adventure as a launch game for the PlayStation 5. Ditching the Little Big Planet moniker entirely, as well as the series' roots as a 2.5D platformer, Sackboy finds himself needing to save Craftworld by traversing through 3D worlds that still have the handcrafted aesthetic that the franchise is known for. Also gone is the Little Big Planet's play, create, share ethos, as there is no custom content to be found. You can still dress up your Sackboy with costume pieces and paint jobs, but not even close to the extent that you could in the original games. That being said, the game is still very charming, and my highlight was definitely the Rip Snorter, a final challenge that has you take on all of the game's time trials in a single run, leaving little room for error. One downside of playing through games years after they released though, is finding others to play with online. I ended up having to play through the co-op levels by myself with both a controller and a keyboard, and let me tell you, acing those levels while juggling 2 control inputs at the same time might be the most suffercore challenge I put myself through this year. There's just something about climbing in games that just scratches an itch. Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, Grow Home, Grow Up, the Tomb Raider reboot, you name it, I've played it. That's all I was looking for when it came to Jusant, a game where I could just immerse myself with a mountain and ascend my way to the top. There's some environmental storytelling to be had for those who are into that sort of thing as you explore the remains of an abandoned civilization. The final game I played this year was the conclusion to the To the Moon series, Imposter Factory. Without going into too much detail, as it's a relatively short experience that's somewhat connected to the previous entries, this was one of the few games where the time travel mechanic did make thematic sense to me. There's a moment late in the game where everything clicked for me that had me thinking, oh shit, when it was finally revealed. I'll leave it at that. If you're looking for a short series that you can play through that isn't heavy on gameplay, To the Moon and its sequels Finding Paradise and Imposter Factory are a great place to start. I'd be remiss not to mention the downsides of clearing your gaming backlog, and that's when you run into a game that you just don't enjoy whatsoever. While I ended up powering through all 63 games I played last year, early on this year I faced an obstacle, Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'm not a big RPG guy, but I've been intrigued by this game for so long. I used to read articles on IGN about the fall of 38 Studios, how the state of Rhode Island invested millions of dollars into this project. I was all over it, but I never played it. Finally, I took the leap of faith and tried it out very early in the year, and what a mistake that ended up being. The game, in my opinion, did not age well at all. I'm usually not a stickler when it comes to graphics, but the game just looked visually unappealing to me, and after playing for roughly 2 hours, I simply had enough, saved the game, closed it, and promptly uninstalled it. Nothing about the game was of interest to me, and it's a shame what happened behind the scenes with the studio's downfall and their failed MMO project that spawned this. Other than outing his former teammates' brain cancer, this was probably the worst thing Kurt Schilling has ever done. Finally, I think it's worth mentioning the 2 games I spent the most time playing this year, at least according to my Steam replay. Deadlock and DOTA2. I played through the entirety of the Groundfall storyline in Dota, and Deadlock became my vice for months after I got an invitation to the alpha in early June. IV was my main squeeze, and always will be. I procrastinated making this video. Whoops. Maybe I'll get 2025's video done before 2026. Maybe I won't. Who knows? Thanks for watching. Also, I tried installing Crysis at one point and the game doesn't work on modern PCs. Don't make jokes that my PC can't run Crysis. Thanks.